Living in Sacramento, California, Laura Samuels was a marketing executive 34 years old. She employed Bright Ideas Marketing, a large firm. Laura was well known at her company for her driven, success-oriented personality. Her cheerful demeanor and balanced hectic work schedule helped her to be well-liked among friends and colleagues. Laura enjoyed outdoor sports like camping and hiking. She traveled to Yosemite National Park and Lake Tahoe rather regularly. She also belonged to a neighborhood book group where she delighted in talking about her favorite Joyce Lehman works. Laura's acquaintances said she was always willing to help people and gentle. She wore a brilliant smile that would brighten a room. Laura was organizing a unique family camping trip in June 2010. Excited about their forthcoming adventure were she and her husband, Carl, together with their 2 children, Velveeta, age 8, and Ponderosa, age 10. Laura had already loaded food, sleeping bags, and their tent. She even had fresh hiking boots from LL Bean for the trip. Laura's kids were excited about roasting marshmallows and around the campfire storytelling. Laura expected a major promotion at work. Her manager had made hints that she might take over as marketing department head. For Laura, who had put much effort over many years, this promotion was a dream come true. Looking forward to the fresh challenges and possibilities the future would present, she was enthusiastic about it. Laura also kept somewhat close to her family, often visiting to spend time with their grandchildren. Her parents resided in nearby Vacaville. Though Laura's sister Emily lived in Los Angeles, they stayed in constant contact by phone calls and emails. Laura made care to keep in touch with her loved ones since she treasured these bonds. Laura was vibrantly alive and exciting in the days before she passed. The chance for a promotion at work and the camping trip excited her. Her friends and relatives recall her as a compassionate and caring person who constantly put others first. To everyone who knew Laura, her untimely death was a startling and terrible loss. Carl Samuels woke early on June 14, 2010, getting ready for work. Around 7 in the morning, Sacramento, California's sun was brilliantly blazing. Carl noted Laura, his wife, was not in bed. He went downstairs thinking she could be in the kitchen. He discovered Laura's dead body in the living room, terror gripping him. Laura had been hairbrush battered to death. Her face was battered, and she showed traces of fighting. Carl contacted 911 right away, his voice faltering as he tried to describe what he had discovered. Shocked and unable to realize his devoted wife was gone, he calmly noting specifics, the 911 operator sent emergency personnel and police to the Samuels house. Tears running down his face, Carl sat by Laura's body waiting for aid to show up. He was confused, grieved, and incredulous at once. Within minutes, emergency responders showed up. Laura was dead, paramedics verified, and police promptly locked down the scene. Carl hesitated to respond to inquiries and clearly seemed disturbed. He continued saying how much he loved Laura and how he didn't know who would want to hurt her. The investigators observed his anxiety, but they also kept in mind that in these kinds of situations the spouse is typically a person of interest. Outside, intrigued by the police presence, residents began to assemble. The word went fast around the town. Local TV stations, including KCRA3, started covering the event, noting Laura's name and characterizing her as a beloved community figure. Late morning, the house was a hive of activity. Arriving to gather further proof were forensic experts. They took samples from the murder scene, dusted for fingerprints, and gently packaged the hairbrush as proof. Each element was painstakingly recorded. Laura's death started to sink in for her friends and family as the day progressed. Messages and calls in expressing shock and grief flooded in. Everyone who knew her was in shock and struggling to process the terrible loss of a loving wife, mother, and friend when word of her passed. On June 14, 2010, the Sacramento police answered 911 calls swiftly. Officer and emergency responders showed up at the Samuels house in minutes. Leading the inquiry were Detective Patricia Johnson and Detective Mark Hernandez, her colleague. Detective Hernandez, well known for his meticulous and diligent work, and Detective Johnson, recognized for her keen eye and commitment, took front stage right away. The scene of crime was unsettling. Laura Samuels lying on the living room floor, obviously dead and battered with a hairbrush discovered close by. Blood splattered on the carpet, and furniture was overturned, displaying evidence of a fierce struggle. The apparently spotless scene suggested that the assailant might have tried to hide their tracks. The investigators started by guarding the scene to make sure nobody might tamper with the proof. They painstakingly recorded everything, snapping pictures and noting every detail. Shortly afterward, forensic professionals arrived to gather actual evidence. They swept for fingerprints on the door handles, chairs, and hairbrush. Along with other possible DNA evidence from the scene, they collected blood samples. Detective Johnson met with clearly disturbed and tearful Carl Samuels. She inquired of him about the circumstances preceding Laura's body discovery. Carl said he discovered Laura in the living room after getting ready for work early in morning. Hey true crime solvers, interested in more real-life murder mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. And do you have any thoughts about this case? Or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Stay safe, true crime. The unrevealed stories. He knew not who could have done this to her. Detective Hernandez looked about the house as Johnson was interviewing Carl. Searching for any evidence of forced access, he came nowhere. This implied Laura might have let her attacker inside knowing who they were. Hernandez said Laura seemed taken off guard as her hands showed no defensive wounds. Outside, neighbors started to assemble observing police activities. The detectives asked some people, but none of them claimed seeing anything odd that morning. Laura was well-liked, hence her death dealt a devastating blow to everyone who knew her. The neighborhood was stunned and afraid. The detectives had gathered all the evidence they could locate by midday. For more study at the crime lab, they bagged the hairbrush and other objects. Arriving to collect Laura's body for an autopsy, a coroner would be able to provide more information regarding the cause of death and timing. Reviewing the facts and organizing their next actions, Detective Johnson and Hernandez stayed in the office all day. Though aware of their challenging case, they were resolved to get Laura and her family justice. Laura Samuels' husband, Carl Samuels, was the first suspect under inquiry. Working as a software developer, Carl was 37 years old. Though he was known to be smart, he was also somewhat shy and would frequently spend more time with his computer than with people. Carl was a loving spouse, but acquaintances said he had grown distant and worried recently. On June 15, 2010, Carl was brought in by the police for interrogation at the Sacramento Police Department. Leading the interrogation were detectives Patricia Johnson and Mark Hernandez. Carl seemed tired and shattered. Red with tears, his eyes reflected real anguish over Laura's passing. Detective Johnson began by inquiring of Carl about his relationship with Laura. After 12 years of marriage, Carl said they had 2 children, Velveeta, age 8, and Ponderosa, age 10. He said that their choice to engage in a wife-swap sex fantasy had lately caused friction in their marriage. Carl had urged Laura to join this fantasy with another couple, Jessica and Kenneth Planters. This fixation had generated conflict between him and Laura. Regarding the evening Laura died, Carl said he had been working late on a state government contract for TechWave, a reputable computer company. He claimed to have gone to bed after midnight and not woke up till the next morning when he discovered Laura's body. Given he had been home alone throughout the murder, his alibi was poor. Detective Hernandez inquired of Carl on his relationship with Jessica Planters. Carl argued that nothing had anything to do with the murder, even though he acknowledged he thought Jessica was beautiful and they had many times sex together. He kept fidgeting in this section of the interview, clearly uncomfortable. The investigators noted Carl's apparent anguish as well as his tension and anxiety. They wanted to know whether he had lately argued with Laura. Carl said a few days before her death, they had argued over the wife swap idea and his inclination in sexual experimentation. Carl had been annoyed when Laura told him she wanted no more participation. Carl totally cooperated with the cops despite his emotional state. He gave access to his computer and phone for more research. Though wary, Detectives Johnson and Hernandez still thought of him as a suspect. More data would help them to either clear him of suspicion or confirm his participation. Carl was told not to leave town even though he was let home as the interrogation ended. Knowing they had to investigate all conceivable avenues in the case to uncover the truth about who killed Laura Samuels, the investigators kept gathering facts. 32-year-old yoga teacher Jessica Planters was the second person under inquiry. Jessica was gregarious and charismatic, always outgoing. She instructed yoga in Zen Flow Yoga, a well-known studio in downtown Sacramento. Her free-spirited approach and capacity for interpersonal connection won many in the community appreciation. Under the wife swap deal with Laura and Carl Samuels and her husband, Kenneth, she had been attempting to persuade Carl to leave Laura for her. She had become excessively fixated on him. On June 16, 2010, detectives Patricia Johnson and Mark Hernandez hauled Jessica into the Sacramento Police Department for interrogation. Jessica looked calm and collected when she arrived sporting casual yoga clothing. Detective Johnson started by inquiring of Jessica on her relationship with Carl. Jessica told Carl straight out that she loved him and that she experimented sexually with him. She claimed she thought Carl felt the same way but that his marriage to Laura tore him apart. Regarding the evening Laura died, Jessica said she was at home with her husband, Kenneth. She stated they went to bed early and watched a movie. Detective Hernandez noted, nonetheless, that her alibi lacked witnesses to support it, therefore weakening it. Then Jessica discussed the wife swap agreement. She said Laura had grudgingly accepted since Carl had suggested it. For Jessica, it presented a fantastic chance to have sex with Carl. She said she had been attempting to persuade Carl to leave Laura, but she denied any part in Laura's passing. Jessica appeared to be hiding something, the police noted even as she was cooperative. Her cool head fit very nicely against the gravity of the matter. They prodded her about her fixation on Carl and whether it might have motivated her to hurt Laura. Jessica said she would never hurt anyone and maintained her innocence. Jessica's phone records were checked during the questioning. They told Carl several calls and messages, including some sent on the evening the crime took place. Given Jessica's great curiosity in Carl, this information heightened further questions. Jessica cooperated, but her fixation with Carl and her poor alibi made her a strong suspect. To either accuse or clear her, the investigators understood they required more specific proof. They kept hunting for any hints linking her to Laura's murder, therefore exploring her background. Jessica was let to go when the questioning stopped, but she was told not to leave town. Knowing that Jessica's suspected involvement in a crime had to be fully investigated, Detectives Johnson and Hernandez stayed committed to find the truth. For days following Laura Samuels' untimely death, on June 18, 2010, fresh data surfaced providing a vital breakthrough for the investigation. Sacramento was cold and foggy that morning. A neighbor of the Samuels, Mrs. Evelyn Turner, called Detective Patricia Johnson from 2 homes down. Mrs. Turner said she had come upon something odd while strolling her dog in Land Park, a neighboring park. Under a shrub next to a picnic spot, Mrs. Turner had seen a discarded bag. Inside the bag, she discovered a smartphone and some bloodied gloves. She phoned the police right away, and Detectives Johnson and Hernandez showed up 30 minutes later. Carefully gathering the bag and its contents, they put it in evidence bags to prevent contamination. Returning back to the Sacramento Police Department, the investigators looked over the fresh material. Sent to the crime lab for DNA analysis, the bloodied gloves. Locked. The smartphone was delivered to the tech department to be unlocked and examined. Detective Hernandez pointed out that the phone was a newer model, an iPhone 4, just launched a few weeks prior. The investigators went over their case notes while waiting for the outcomes. The bloodied gloves implied the killer had sought to discard evidence far from the crime scene. The smartphone can either belong to the killer or someone else involved in the incident. The crime lab phoned later that afternoon with DNA findings. Though Laura Samuels' DNA profile matched the blood on the gloves, there was also another DNA profile within the gloves. It was noteworthy as the profile did not match Carl Samuels. The tech crew also got the smartphone unlocked. It registered under second suspect Jessica Planters, the yoga teacher. Between Jessica and Carl, the investigators discovered many texts and call logs, some from the murder night. Messages also revealed Jessica's growing irritation and jealousy toward Laura. This fresh material startled Detective Johnson and Hernandez. The letters exposed that although Jessica had been trying to get Carl to leave Laura, her attempts had failed. Now, their case against Jessica was stronger since the smartphone and the gloves connected her more precisely to the crime. The investigators gave their next moves much thought. Knowing they had to bring Jessica back in for further inquiry using this fresh data, though the case was beginning to line up, they still had to make sure every element was closely examined. The detectives had fresh motivation as the day came to finish. The fresh data had given a vital clue, and they were resolved to follow it to expose Laura Samuels' murder's whole truth. The third suspect under inquiry was 34-year-old personal trainer Kenneth Planters. Kenneth had a great confidence and a great charm. Working at Sacramento's well-known FitLife gym, he trained customers and engaged in competitive sports. Kenneth had taken part in the wife swap agreement with Laura and Carl Singles and encouraged his free-spirited wife Jessica. But Kenneth had grown more and more dubious and envious. Detectives Patricia Johnson and Mark Hernandez brought Kenneth in for interrogation on June 19 to 2010. Kenneth showed up at the Sacramento Police Department sporting pants and a FitLife gym t-shirt. Though he seemed tense, he tried to keep calm. Detective Johnson started by inquiring of Kenneth on his relationship with Jessica. Kenneth said they had a generally good marriage after 8 years of marriage. He did concede, though, that the wife swap arrangement had created conflict. As Kenneth was growing affections for Carl Singles and felt excluded, he admitted he had grown awkward with the arrangement. Regarding Laura's murder night, Kenneth said he was at home with Jessica. He stated they went to bed early after seeing Iron Man 2, which had just come out a few weeks prior. Although Kenneth's alibi matched Jessica's, the fresh evidence connecting Jessica to the crime made the investigators dubious. Detective Hernandez probed Kenneth about his sentiments for his Laura. Kenneth said he loved Laura and had no intention of hurting her. Claiming he had nothing to do with Laura's death, he seemed truly disturbed by it. The investigators did observe, though, his jealousy and discomfort with the wife swap arrangement. Then the investigators showed Kenneth the fresh evidence, the bloody hands and the smartphone discovered in Land Park. Clearly stunned, Kenneth denied knowing about the objects. He said he was being honest about his location on the murder night and had no motivation to harm Laura. Kenneth cooperated, but his poor alibi and developing jealousy made him a suspect. As they kept looking at Jessica, the detectives decided to monitor him closely. They thought Kenneth could know more regarding the incident and Jessica's involvement. Kenneth was told not to leave town even though his interrogation session came to an end. Knowing that the evidence was guiding them toward case closure, Detectives Johnson and Hernandez were resolved to expose the whole truth. The Sacramento police broke through the Laura Samuels case on June 20, 2010. Following close review of all the facts, they determined Jessica Planters was the killer. 32-year-old yoga teacher Jessica had grown fixated on Laura's husband, Carl Samuels. If Laura disappeared from the picture, Jessica thought Carl would be with her. The investigators put together Jessica's actions in killing Laura. Jessica had visited the Samuels house that evening, June 13, 2010. Laura would be alone and Carl would be working late. She knew. She severely beat Laura with a hairbrush so that no noise would wake the neighbors. Then Jessica set the scene to seem as a battle, attempting to fool the cops. Jessica's drive came from her intense fixation on Carl and her need to replace Laura in his life. Eliminating Laura would force Carl to pick her. She also wanted to frame her own husband, Kenneth, for the murder, therefore removing both her romantic rival and unhappy husband from the picture. Detective Patricia Johnson and Detective Mark Hernandez visited Jessica's house about 2:00 p.m. on June 20th to arrest her. The dismal attitude was reflected in the dreary sky. Jessica surprised me. The investigators showed up when she was instructing a yoga class at Zenflow Yoga. Jessica first tried to keep her cool when they told her of the arrest, but she quickly started to cry and argue her innocence. Jessica was handcuffed by the cops and driven from the studio. Local media like KCRA3 and Fox 40 covered the arrest as the word got out rapidly. Watching Jessica, a once-admired yoga instructor, being hauled away by the police stunned the community. When Laura's family learned of Jessica's detention, their response was one of mixed feelings. relief, and grief. The treachery crushed Carl Samuels as he realized his wife's death came from someone he knew and trusted. He battled to process the loss and the horrifying way it occurred. Though Ponderosa and Velveeta, Laura's children, were too small to really comprehend, they felt the weight of the circumstances. The investigators felt accomplished as Jessica was being transported to the Sacramento Police Department. They had found and caught Laura's horrible murders offender effectively. Still, they understood the case was far from finished as they got ready for the trial. September 15, 2010 saw the start of Jessica Planter's trial in the Sacramento County Courthouse. Under the direction of 45-year-old District Attorney Lisa Kamabukuro, who is well known for her keen legal sense and commanding courtroom demeanor, the prosecution put a strong case against Jessica. Kamabukuro said Jessica's drive to kill Laura as a competition and her fixation on Carl Samuels motivated her to carry out the crime. She went into great length on the evidence, including the bloody gloves and the smartphone discovered in Land Park, which linked Jessica to the crime scene. From the defense standpoint, 50-year-old attorney Michael Rachmanov, known for tackling difficult cases, argued Jessica was innocent and framed by someone else. Rachmanov asserted that the police had not extensively looked into other possible suspects, like Kenneth Planters, and that there was no concrete proof connecting Jessica to the murder. He also proposed that the glove's DNA evidence might have been falsified. Laura Samuels' family watched the trial with sorrowful hearts from the sidelines. Laura's husband Carl Samuels seemed upset and frequently held back tears. Ponderosa and Velveeta, their children, were absent as they too little to have seen the emotional intensity of the trial. The incident is even more tragic as friends and neighbors who knew Laura said she was a devoted professional and loving mother. 3 days of jury deliberation, they came back on September 25, 2010, bearing a decision. Jessica Planters was guilty of first-degree murder. As the judge declared the outcome, the courtroom was bursting with a mix of relief and grief. Jessica kept a stony look and displayed little feeling. Her scheme to kill Laura and blame Kenneth had backfired, and she now paid for it. Laura's family members offered heartfelt remarks during the sentencing phase. Carl talked about the terrible effects losing Laura had on their children. Jessica Planters was condemned by the judge to life in jail without chance of parole. Laura's family saw the sentencing as fair, but it could never completely ease their grief from their loss. For everyone engaged, the sentence decision had a significant impact. With knowledge that justice had been done, Laura's family felt closure. Shocked by the atrocity, the town started to mend. Laura's terrible murder nevertheless loomed large. Jessica's conviction made clear that such a deliberate and forceful deed would not go unpunished. Those who knew Laura wanted to remember her for the lively and lovely person she was, not for the cruel manner she was abducted from them as the trial came to end. For everyone engaged in the case, life gently started to go on following the trial. Now a single father, Carl Samuels concentrated on raising his 2 daughters, Ponderosa and Velveeta. Seeking a new beginning, he chose to leave their Sacramento house. They moved to a smaller town close so they can start to mend away from the terrible memories. Carl left his work at Tetchwave to spend more time with his kids. Finding comfort in speaking with others who had gone through similar losses, he registered them in a new school and joined a support group for bereaved spouses. To assist his kids deal with the tragedy of losing Laura, he also sought treatment for himself and them. Transferred to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, Jessica Planters, now serving a comparable term without the possibility of parole, she grew lonely in prison, with few visitors and little interaction with the outside world. Her mistaken behavior and obsession with Carl had brought her to a life behind bars, far from the free-spirited yoga teacher she once was. Her husband Kenneth Planters battled to reconstruct his life. He left Sacramento and settled in San Francisco, where he started working as a personal trainer at another gym. To help with his bewilderment and sense of betrayal, he visited counselors. Though Kenneth tried to move ahead, the events and the knowledge that his wife was capable of such brutality stayed profoundly with him. Those touched by Laura's life and terrible death sought healing and serenity in the years that followed the trial. Laura's loss still hurt, But they discovered ways to move forward, keeping Laura's memory with them and trying to live their lives with the same love and will she had displayed. Laura Samuels' sad tale reminds us of the terrible results of treachery and obsession. Thank you for joining us on this episode of True Crime. The Unrevealed Stories. Stay tuned for more stories that delve into the darkest corners of human nature.